you've got enough time because you said you want to go to a deeper and darker side
Well,
of
yeah.
the GDPR.
So I'm Mike Small, and I'm an industry analyst. I spent most of my career developing software and indeed developing security software. It was in doing that that I realized both the importance and the power of regulations and compliance. In particular, one kind of watershed was Sarbanes-Oxley, where we had been working with a large financial institution, and the architects had given us a contract to do a certain security project. And this project went on, and the architects kept changing what they needed, and we kept accommodating them. And after 2 years, we were called to a meeting. And at this meeting, what actually happened was some people turned up that we'd never seen. And they said, we're the board of directors, and we can't understand why it is you've been taking 2 years when all we asked for was compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley. And basically, the security architects and the technical architects within that organization had never, ever mentioned that. All they did was they came to us with a series of technical requirements, which we were diligently working on. So, regulation is very important. Organizations want to comply with things. Most organizations take a proper judgment as to compliance, which is why it seems to me that GDPR is an important area. However, most of the kind of discussion that we've had with people, most of the events I've been to or the webcasts that I've listened to have been from vendors trying to tell you how much you're going to lose, or from lawyers telling you how you really need to look after, pay them loads of money to write the contracts for you, or people who are talking about what I might call the normal processing of things. And so in this talk, what I wanted to do was first of all to kind of touch on some of the anomalies the gentleman at the back was looking at, some of the darker sides, and also looking at what I call the data iceberg that we have, that people perhaps aren't considering and that they ought to consider. So if we look at what the GDPR was basically about, it was about fair and transparent processing. And so one of the questions that keeps coming up is there any kind of conflict? And clearly, if you look, GDPR is related to personal data, but there are at least 2 financial services regulations that recently came out. The 4th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. And this is interesting because not very long ago, I moved house. And so, of course, as you do, even if you've got adequate funds, you always seem to need money sort of in the process. So we closed, my wife and I, closed a couple of bank accounts, closed a couple of building society accounts, and went into the bank to pay in these couple of checks, and were immediately locked in a room. And someone then came out and well, I could recognise what it was. It was, can you sort of explain to us how you managed to get all this money without either drug dealing or selling arms or whatever it is? And I came away with the feeling that if I'd have said, you know, well, I've just sold a submarine to Saudi Arabia or something, that I would have had an easier life. So, in order to prevent money laundering and to counter terrorist financing, which actually are not quite the same thing, but nevertheless they're counted to be this, there is this regulation which seems to have certain provisions in it which may be questionable. The other thing is the Payment Services Directive 2, which is in fact in the UK becoming the the Open Banking Initiative, which is something rather our UK Brexit version of PSD2, and that in itself is going to introduce new people, new organisations into the payment chain, and is going to make it even more difficult when you make simple mistakes because of the fact that if you pay money under this, you then find that if you paid it in error, that you can't just find out who you paid it to, you have to get the bank to recover it. And if you ask the bank, well, who actually received this money that I sent in error, they will say, we can't tell you that because of privacy. So let's look at these things in a little bit more detail. That clearly the growth of the mafia is perhaps the way to describe it. The growth of the belief that criminals are using the financial systems in order to launder large quantities of money and doing this with impunity has led to a worldwide crackdown on what is called money laundering. And in the EU this turned into this directive which is transformed into a set of regulations, and interestingly I think it was 44 pages of the EU directive managed to become 120 pages of the UK regulation. And so for those who say that it's all this EU regulation that's causing us problems, we're pretty good at gold-plating stuff ourselves. And that's been effective since June 2016. Now, like I said earlier on, both of these directives, there were comments on the drafts of those from the Information Commissioner, and really I based some of my comments on this. Now, clearly the idea behind this is that you want to exercise due diligence over who is paying money and who is opening accounts and where they got that money from. Now, if in doing that you were to alert the person making the payment to what's going on, they might be able to take action to escape or to get away with it. And just to give another real example, I have a colleague who is a very a road warrior, I think is the way you would describe it. He's constantly on the move around Europe, but he's also very financially savvy. And when he was in, I think it was Switzerland, he saw that he could get some more interest on his little nest egg if he moved it from one bank to another. So he did that. He did a transfer using his computer. And when he got back to England, he found all his accounts were frozen. And when he went into the bank and said, why have you frozen my accounts? They said to him, we can't tell you. So, and in the end, when he finally got to the bottom of this, they had, their IT systems had detected that he was making this transfer from what they considered to be a suspicious environment, i.e. Switzerland, and that they couldn't tell him because they were preventing this under the anti-money laundering regulations. So, you know, this is the kind of conflict that we have. That on the one hand we have the GDPR, which is saying everything that's done with your data should be done in a fair and transparent manner. But then there are all of these circumstances which you can sort of justifiably say, but it isn't really right to tell people. Now, So then there is the question of public registers, and indeed that's the very question that you brought up again. And this was one of the things that was actually brought out by the Information Commissioner's Office in the relation to AML4. And in AML4, it requires that the banks take extra diligence when they are dealing with transactions or opening accounts for what are called politically exposed persons, or PEPs, not PEPs, you know, we used to know it. And the idea, of course, is that the notion is that there are sort of strange dictators from peculiar countries that are robbing the country blind and are coming with their gold bars to London to put it into the bank. So if you are one of those people, then there has to be a much more detailed look into what your circumstances are and where you've got the money from. But it's not only the people, the politically exposed persons, but also their associates. So when you look at what the regulation actually said, it said that they can use the information that they have or to use other credible information. Now, so how do you challenge that? How do you know it's happened? When somebody signs up for a Conservative Party membership or a membership of the Labour Party or the Liberals or whatever, their name goes on a membership list, and that membership list could be used for these circumstances. When people join that party, did they realise that it's possible that that information could be used to prevent them from doing certain kinds of financial transactions? So clearly there needs to be some care with that. It also implies that the banks and the financial institutions are going to themselves be setting up registers of people who they consider to be politically exposed persons. And being on that list probably is something that is highly potentially damaging if in fact it is used in the wrong kind of a way. And so the banks will need to, and the regulation requires them to take extra care over that kind of stuff. So far, so good. But what does it really mean? Well, I gave you my personal example, but here is another example of a company that made a hand water-held gun for toilet cleaning, ended up being left with stock stuck in China and unable to pay its suppliers because the business account was frozen. Because for some reason or another, they were unable to get the answers that they expected from the customer. So it's not clear to me, whilst there are clearly justifiable reasons for, if you will, implementing these kinds of regulations and the provisions in those regulations, often it seems to me that organisations and financial institutions hide behind privacy for what is really poor customer service. Just like locking up pensioners in rooms when they come in to pay a small check-in. In fact, there was a rant in the Times, I think a couple of days ago, by an MP. It had happened to his mother or something like that. So there's been a lot of talk over this morning about GDPR and what people should be doing. Well, so 2.5 years ago, I can't remember how long ago it was, we produced an action plan. And we said there were 6 things that every organisation should do. Now, many organisations have got plans with 10, 12, 15 things, but we thought there were 6 things that you really, really, really needed to do. And so I'm going to go through those now. And then we will look at another area. So the first thing, and I think this has been emphasised by all of the people that spoke prior to my talk, which is you need to discover what you've got. And this includes the data, it includes the resources, the processing resources that you have, and where that data is, and what you're doing with it. And it turns out that that is potentially a lot more difficult than people might think. First of all, if you consider an example that I came across, which was another financial institution, and interestingly, the financial institutions have apparently been taking more care over this than some. Their problem was that although they had branches throughout Europe and were quite a centralised organisation, there were all these local privacy laws that meant that their personal data, what of their customers, was distributed in databases around Europe. So, like I said, that if you go to Germany, many Germans believe that sending anything to do with personal data on Germans outside Germany is illegal. And so you find that around Europe there are specific things that you may be required to store that are not allowed to be stored in other parts of the world, and vice versa. And so you find that the idea of master data may be very good, but it's currently very fragmented. Then on top of that, you have another problem. And I remember describing GDPR to a marketing manager who went slowly whiter and whiter as I was describing what was going on. And he said, but every time I do a marketing campaign, I buy an email list. And I get it emailed to me in a spreadsheet, and I just send it out to all the people. Surely that's not covered. Well, of course it is. So basically, there are many organisations that have got these uncontrolled spreadsheets, and that took me back to Sarbanes-Oxley, because when we were looking at Sarbanes-Oxley, everybody suddenly started to focus on the mainframe systems that were processing the financial information. But in fact, the problem that the auditors found was that the input to all of those systems was coming through a raft of uncontrolled and often incorrectly programmed spreadsheets that were gathering it together. So spreadsheets, email, documents, and so on and so forth, paper even, is containing this kind of personal information. So finding it all is a real problem. Then we talked about consent. Well, in some ways, the good thing about consent is it's now clear what you have to do, and you really need to make sure you get together with your lawyers and discover what the right wording should be. But in fact, you need to make sure that when you find this data, you also can find a trail to explain why you collected it, whether or not you got consent, and how that consent was received. So I won't dwell any more upon consent. I think a lot of people have spoken about that. But having got hold of it, you need to control it. And that's an interesting question, because there's a whole series of different ways that you might want to control it, or you might need to control it. But one of the things is, once again, we have a disconnect, that nearly all of the systems that are in place in organisations that give permissions for access, that give entitlements to do things, are based on an organisational approval cycle. But now you have, if you mix that together with consent, you now find that you need to somehow or other link the ability of a user of a data subject to the systems that allows the data to be used, almost on a field-by-field level. And that is not kind of just normal process. It's something rather different. So we'll talk in more detail about control in the next few slides. Cloud. Cloud is a fascinating area because what I have seen is, having spent a lot of time looking at cloud services and having listened to the things that were said by Mr. De Silva this morning about contracts. Clearly, cloud providers, major cloud providers, they give you a contract. And the deal is you either accept that contract or you use somebody else's cloud service. Largely speaking, they do not negotiate contracts. They might do if it's a government, but I've found some very large organizations that have beaten their brains out on the cloud service providers and basically say, that's the contract, you've got it, or not. And those contracts are exactly as was described in that table by Dr. De Silva, which is they are biased towards defending the cloud provider rather than defending you. Now, GDPR put a cold shiver down the spine of the cloud service providers, and I saw, first of all, lobbying in Brussels by the big American cloud providers to try and moderate what was written into GDPR, followed by what I would describe as defensive moves. So nearly all of them now will give you what they describe as a GDPR compliant set of processing addendum or whatever it is to their standard contract. And if you sign that, then they will say that they are complying with what needs to be complied with in order to satisfy the legal requirements around a binding processing contract. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say whether it's good or not. The second thing is that there's been a lot of PR and I'm trying to think of how best to describe it, a lot of publicity around the shared processing model to do with the cloud. And I see this perhaps as a positioning by the cloud service providers to make sure that if push comes to shove, if there is a breach and the cloud customer tries to place the blame on the cloud service provider, they will say, well, we've made it public, but we are responsible for the cloud and you're responsible for how you use it. And that under these circumstances, it was your misuse that was the problem. The other area is that another defensive move perhaps has been the creation over the past 12 months of codes of conduct. And there are there are actually 3 codes of conduct that I know of. There's a CSA code of conduct, that's the Cloud Security Alliance one. There is the Cloud Infrastructure Providers Europe, CISPE, I think it is. And there's also a code of conduct which has come from another group of companies which allegedly comes from the Working 29 Working Party. So there are 3 codes of conduct. None of them have independent attestations, and none of them has been tested. But nevertheless, it's better than nothing. And the codes of conduct basically are trying to say, although they appear to be just general codes of conduct, if you read them, they are really written just as though they are intended to protect the cloud providers against liability for misprocessing under GDPR. So if you're going to use the cloud, you have to remember that you as the controller are probably going to be the first person that's responsible, and that you need to really have assured yourself that the way it will be used and processed in the cloud is going to be compliant. Now, having said that, I will reinforce what I said earlier on, which is that the majority of these large cloud service providers provide a more secure and a more compliant service than could be provided by most small businesses and many medium and large businesses as well, because they have invested significantly in the expertise and technology, and they have the scale to be able to do that. Data protection by default and design. That's an important area which has been talked about quite a bit this morning, and I'm later on going to talk about some of the aspects to do with that. You have to apply, you have to employ a data protection officer, and like I said in the earlier panel, my advice to all technical people is make sure you employ a data protection officer, because as technicians you may know how to secure systems, but it doesn't necessarily mean you know how to make things compliant. And the data protection officer should be someone who has the legal and privacy-based knowledge in order to be able to do that. And that then gives you a way of leading the technical measures that you take in the most appropriate manner.
Does the size of organisations relate to appointment of DPO or
Sorry?
the size of organisation?
I think there is a size on it, but again, my advice to everybody would be find one, because you don't have to employ them as an employee. You know, indeed, one of my colleagues who works for a big legal firm is the data protection officer for a large company. So he takes the responsibility, if you will, for that. So the final thing is have a plan for breach notification. And you know, so many of these breaches, the organizations are clearly unprepared. And the scenario that I often paint is that it could well be that your CEO will find out that there has been a data breach when he comes to work in his new shiny office at 8 o'clock in the morning and can't get in because Sky TV wants to interview him. And that is not the way to start off dealing with a data breach. You know, you have to have a proper process in place, and that process should be tested, it should have been thought through, and it should now include all of the aspects that are required by GDPR, which are particularly to do with notification. Now, there's a lot of other things to do with that data breach, which you should be doing, including handling the press and so forth. But you need to modify your process with that. So where do we see organizations actually, where do they stand at the moment? So the first thing is that, again, we talk to a lot of large organizations rather than small to medium organizations, and many of them appear to have been spending a lot of money on what I'd call process review and re-engineering. They've been paying money to the big consultancy firms to look at the data flows and the process flows before they do anything else. And that's not bad. It's making lots of money for them. But it's also interesting because at the same time you see the vendors running around trying to sell different kinds of software. And so I'm not seeing a lot of large firms just going out and purchasing security software or services. Nearly everyone has got the message that they need to appoint a DPO. And this is the big organisations, and it's the smaller and certainly the small to medium-sized ones. I don't think are anything like this. That they have not been. Many of them are not doing as well as they would hope. You would hope that they would be doing. And in a sense, it was good news for me this morning to hear that the DPO is receiving a lot of calls from small businesses about that. It could well be that we tend to deal with the larger organisations rather than the small to medium ones. The next thing that we see them doing is what I call refreshing consent. They've gone around trying to discover their data. When they've discovered it, they either did not have the records that they could trust, or they have been advised by their lawyers to re-request consent. And many of you, I'm sure, will have received this. You either get letters or emails saying, we want to keep in touch. Please will you, because of the upcoming regulation, please will you just tick this box here to agree to continue to receive these emails or whatever. And that's actually part of this thought through process. And finally, what we're actually seeing is that everybody's focusing on the production data. Well, that's understandable. This is the data that you are actually collecting for the specific purpose, and indeed and how that data is used for that purpose. Well, that's good, but it's not what I would call the data iceberg. So I'm now going to look at all of this. So here's what kind of the model that GDPR sort of seems to promote, that everybody thinks about. The data subject sort of gives up their data for some kind of lawful collection. They want to buy something, they want some kind of a service, they want to get some kind of information. That goes into this personal data, and then over a period of time is processed in a lawful manner, and at the end it's put in a dustbin. And during the time that this data is held, the data can be subject to the data subject access rights. So they can say, what have you got about me? I want to change my consent. I'd like you to erase the data. And that's part of the data, and that's part of the way it's used. But in fact, there's all of this other stuff, and I've only picked out some of the things that there is, as was described by some of the previous speakers. There's data that is flowing around that is actually to do with security, and the security logs and so forth. And did you have consent to that? Probably not. Then there is the development, test and QA data. We have this world where all the organisations are trying to reinvent themselves as the digital transformation. And the digital transformation means using the cloud, getting closer to your customers, having better marketing, having new apps. And well, those apps, well, we're a sort of an XYZ corporation. We don't have the app development technology, and we don't have the skills, so we'll outsource that. And in order to do that, you need some kind of data, because that's the test data. So, well, we'll just give them our CRM data. That could be the way that it's being done. And then, of course, there's things like market analysis. Now, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive view, but we reckon that something like 80% of the data in organisations, under the very wide definition of the scope of personal data in the GDPR, is what we would call non-production data. It's data that's there it may exist for some kind of a reason, there may be a rationale for it, but it isn't actually just being used for that kind of straightforward processing. So I'm going to consider two specific examples of that for the purposes of this talk. So let me just go back to this question of real-time security intelligence, SIEM, and so forth. So there's all these products that are around there. There are all these systems that are collecting logs. You've got network activity logs, application logs, user activity logs, and all this kind of stuff. Now, so when you look at what's in these logs, it's things like Mike Small logged on. It's this particular IP address connected, this MAC address connected, that I went to this particular website. Now, when you have to assess this, I've ended up with so many people asking me so many questions about this. I've ended up with this set of tests. And test number one is that data personal data under the terms of GDPR? Now, when you look at what GDPR covers, it specifically says things like network identifiers, as well as other things. So IP addresses, in my view, are like that. Now, that's not to say that I don't get pushback. People say, oh, no. Well, you know, everybody's going through a NAT, so externally you all got one IP address and so forth. And then other people will say things like, well, you know, your identity is so arcane that we can't work out who it was from this peculiar sort of token that we've put out there. But as you'll see later on, there are ways which you can infer things. So let's say that there's a log of my activities, and what you do is you blank out the Mike Small bit. As soon as you see my MAC address, you see where I've been, when I did it. You can correlate this together with other things, and you can say, actually, it really is personal data. So I think the answer is you have to consider that security and event log data is personal data. Then, is it processing? Well, again, if you look at what GDPR says, processing is the collection, the storage, the retrieval, the analysis, and the dissemination of personal data for a particular purpose. Well, it's so broad, is that it has to be considered to be processing. So you can't say it's not processing. So then you have to say, is it fair and legitimate? And is it lawful? And the answer to that, in my humble opinion, is the answer is maybe. And you have to either say that I've got a legitimate purpose for this, and I think most organisations could say there is a legitimate purpose. But you know, this is done for the protection of the organisation and also for the protection of the individuals, because the people whose data you're processing are in fact either the employees or the customers. And as regards could you say it was consent? Well, I think it's difficult. If you work for an American company, you've probably signed a contract which says they can test you for drugs, they can monitor your phone calls, they can read your emails and everything, and it's all fair and lawful. But if you go to Germany, you can't. You know, most of Europe have laws which say you just cannot do that kind of intrusive behaviour, and the UK is somewhere in between. So you cannot say that you give explicit consent, freely given, for your data to be processed in these kinds of ways, simply if you have to give that consent in order to get a job. It's not freely given. So the best that you can hope for is to say it's legitimate. So if it is legitimate, then if it is lawful, then you really need to think that you're going to have to take appropriate security measures to support data subject access rights and to have a compliant contract, a GDPR compliant processing contract, if in fact you are outsourcing the processing of that data, for example, to a managed security service provider or to some kind of cloud scanning service. So basically, in my thesis here, your security logs are going to have to be considered to be potentially personal data, and if it is lost, then you're going to have a problem. You've got a question.
I really like this case because it's a bit bizarre, because secure by default is what you are showing now. You have to prove to them secure by default. We secure that as well.
Yeah. So
does that make sense?
So the point that I made earlier on, which is the kind of the rules of the GDPR, are that you have to prove that you are compliant, rather than that somebody has to prove that you're not, mean that you're going to have to think about this. And I don't think it's going to be the first challenge, but you still need to think about it. There's a question for you.
Yeah, I understand you can have an outsourced data processor, but what happens if, would you be able to outsource data control responsibilities to a third party as well? And if there was a breach, would the liability be on them or on the company?
Well, liability and the lawyer.
No, liability is the wrong word, responsibility then.
Yeah. So I think if you are outsourcing things, then it basically means that if that outsourcing involves the processing of personal data, you have to have a contract which says that they will process it in a way which is compliant with the requirements of GDPR.
So you can have an outsourced data controller as well?
Well, again, you've got a joint thing there, and you saw what had to be said about joint.
Yeah.
So you need a lawyer.
No, I just wondered, because we do a lot of work in the MSP market, so
Yeah. Now, I'm also going to look in this at the other interesting area, which is to do with test and development. And it's just too easy that people say, well, in order to do development, we need some kind of a data set to do it. Or in order to test our applications, we need to make sure that we've got that data set. And, if that's a copy of the personal data that you use as part of your standard applications, then it's personal data. I don't think there's any question. And again, if you take my second test, which is to do with, is it processing, then using it for test purposes must be processing. And once again, we come to the question of is it lawful? Now, in this particular diagram, what I've tried to do is to show just how difficult this can be. Because this morning, we got a very clear answer from the lawyer, which said that if you have outsourced that development to a non-EEA country, even if they are only doing that development by remotely accessing your systems, it is considered to have been transferred. In another world, you may have actually just put a copy in the cloud, or they may have taken a copy into the cloud, and you know how difficult it is to make it difficult or impossible for people to copy files. We do not have mandatory access control mechanisms in most systems. So once you've given a copy of something to a third party, you usually have no control over how that is going to be further processed.
Right. So the interesting thing on that one, I know it's not your point specifically, but if you consider it to have been transferred by remote access, do you not also consider it to have been disposed by closing remote access?
I don't know.
So, if it's that easy to effectively transfer when you're not really transferring anything at all, presumably it must be as easy to close it off and say I've disposed of the data by just breaking the connection.
Well,
I hope so.
Well, and the trouble is, it's this discretionary access control. But once you have given somebody access, it's very difficult to stop them from taking a copy of it and removing that copy. That's the difficulty. So then, if we move on to test 4, is it for the performance of a contract? You know, I'm now going through all the lawful reasons, and I don't believe that you might say it's for the performance of a contract if you are the developer, but if you are the data controller who collected the information, it definitely isn't that. Is it data? Do you have data subject consent? Well, remember, under GDPR it has to be explicit, so you would have had to say to the data subject that you consent to us using your personal data for our development and test purposes to improve the services to you or something. So again, I think that's reasonably doubtful. So again, I believe the only probable way that you could justify it is to say that it's in the legitimate interest of the data control. So once again, we keep finding this legitimate interest is the sort of way out. So if it is part of the legitimate interest, then maybe it's actually allowed for you to do it, and I'm sure it is going to continue to be done. So then you say, if I have got this development being done by Wipro or something in a foreign country, when you gave them the contract to write that application, did you also include in that contract GDPR compliant data processing clauses? And if you didn't, then you're potentially going to be out of compliance. Do you have support for data subject access rights? I mean, we talked about backup and the problem that you raised about backup and multiple backup copies. You know, when somebody says, I want my data erased, it isn't practical to erase it from all of the copies of a backup. If they said, we want our data erased, now potentially you have to say, well, I'm going to erase it in all these copies that I'm using for this kind of processing, for example. And did your development teams consider that they had to implement the appropriate measures to secure access to that development data and to deal with detection and notification of breaches? And I think the answer is probably no, because development teams don't think like that. This is just sort of disposable stuff. So what can you do about it? So I'm now going to sort of take you through, if you will, some of the potential solutions. So people say to me, oh well, we've got good access governance. Well, access governance is a good start. It says that what you're basically doing is you're saying, we are going to make sure that the people that have legitimate access to that data have only got the access that's required. What it doesn't tend to do, it doesn't tend to be good at cloud unless you've got a CASB, a Cloud Access Security Broker. It tends not to be the route that comes in for development, but it could be. But it certainly doesn't protect you against the leakage or the unauthorized copying of the master database. So that is good as far as it goes, but it may not be sufficient depending upon the sensitivity and the risks associated with the particular kind of data that you're holding. So the next strategy that people talk about is encryption. That's good, not foolproof. Encryption is good in the sense that what it does is it protects against the theft of or the leakage of the complete data tables without the key. And naturally what that means is that, of course, the bad guys, the adversaries now, are trying to get hold of credentials, because if you can get hold of the credentials for users, then you get that data as though you were legitimate. It also means that if you're going to use encryption as a protection mechanism for the development and test data, then you need to share the keys. And therein you find that there is a weakness in that if the keys can be stolen, then, or there is mismanagement of those keys, then you've got a problem. And giving that kind of information to development and test people is not, in my view, a particularly advisable way of dealing with it. So the other strategy you've got is anonymization. And anonymization actually is recognised by GDPR as a good thing, as they say. And it's defined as being where the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information. And indeed, it says in another article that the data controller can take account of the existence of appropriate safeguards, which may include encryption or pseudonymization when considering whether processing for another purpose is compatible with the process. So actually, if you encrypt or pseudonymize, that is considered to be a way not of no longer being subject to GDPR, but rather putting that encrypted or pseudonymized data outside the scope of GDPR. So it seems to me to be a pretty good idea that if you're going to have to deal with non-production use of data, pseudonymization and anonymization are perhaps a good way of dealing with it. So here is the suggestion, and I've taken a quote there from the Information Commissioner, which says basically to protect privacy it's better to use or disclose anonymized data than personal data. And what I'm distinguishing in that diagram is that pseudonymization or anonymization is a different process that can be non-reversible, which you can use for the non-production data. So that the encryption process is one which, with the key, you can get the data back. Pseudonymization or anonymization is a way of transforming the data so that you no longer can relate it back. But if you do it right, you can actually make sure that it is still usable for development and test purposes. However, you have to do it right. And here's an example of how not to do it, which is always interesting. In 2006, AOL released this anonymized data, and it was 20 million web searches. And so what they did was they said for each of the web searches, they simply replaced the identity of the user with a number. But it hardly took any time for them to find some elderly lady in some part of America who had a dog and various other kinds of things based on her web searches, and to identify her to a specific person. So simply blanking out or changing the user's identity is not sufficient.
If, for example, you were collecting IP addresses and dropped off the last 2 or 3 digits and that was it, that would count.
NAT, did you say?
No, so if you're collecting IP addresses and you just dropped off the last 2 or 3 digits, or you turned them to zeros, and that was the only data, and that would be anonymous.
That has a name. In pseudonymization, it's called generalization.
Okay.
And that's sort of, whereas you can say, Mike Small lives at an address, that's specific data, it identifies me. So if I say there is a man of a certain age lives this address, that's going to identify me. If you then say there is a man of this age who lives in this postcode, you generalised it, right? Because this postcode is now moved from one address to maybe 20 addresses. You can then start to drop digits off the postcode to generalise it more. And there's a lot of work on that. So let me just move on to the next one. So this is the generalization tool, where what you do is you take the scope of each attribute is widened by this factor k, so that you effectively say that if we take the postcode, it's easier to be described in concrete terms. The postcode, the address identifies 3 or 4 people living at an address. If you put a postcode, it moves it up to something like 60 or 70 people. You can then put it to a district or a town, and as you make it wider, it becomes more difficult to come back, but that's part of a general process. There is another process way of doing generalization, which is called adding noise. So you could take your IP address and you could add or subtract a random amount onto it, or onto each of the bits of that, and that's a similar thing. But you have to be careful, because once again you find that if you just take this generalization and only apply it to one attribute, you find that a postcode, sex and date of birth is almost as good as your name, as an example. So you have to be very careful about how you do these things. And so there's a difference between whether you want to be able to do things like market analysis, or whether you simply want to have credible data in order to do development and test. And the other approach is substitution. And there are a variety of patented methods for what are effectively transforming an attribute to another value which still remains credible. So for example, if you have a telephone number, you want the telephone number to become something that looks like a telephone number but not a similar one. And once again, with all of these, the more you transform, the more anonymized it becomes. If you just transform one, you might as well not have bothered. If you took all of the records to do with me, just wiped out the name or changed the name, it would be so easy to re-infer what my name is from the other information that you would not do this. Now this patented method is really quite fascinating, because what they do is they say, well, let's say we have 500 possible values for that particular field. We have a list of 500 possible values. So you take the actual value of the field in this patented method. You take the AES 128 bit encrypted version. You take the hash of that encrypted version, and you then take the modulus to 500 of that hash, and that gives you a number between 1 and 500. And you use that number between 1 and 500 to look up the attribute. Right? So it's pretty non-linear, and it's not immediately reversible. So is it all good? Well, once again, there are some tests. And the Article 29 Working Party has defined what these tests are about whether anonymization is good. And they basically say, can you still single out an individual from the anonymized data? And if you can, then it wasn't very good. Is it still possible to link the records from that anonymized data to the general information that you have somewhere else? So that's what I was kind of saying, which was that if you just wipe my name out, if you know my age and date of birth and I can look that up somewhere else, then that isn't sufficient. And can you infer it from looking at the attributes? So there are some tests, and once again, that the EU 29 Working Party seems to be a glass half full rather than a glass half empty, in the sense that they produced a table which basically says none of them work. Well, which clearly is not helpful, because I would like to go back to what the Information Commissioner said, which is that if you do this systematically to all of the data that you have, then, or at least do it proportionally in response to the risk that's associated with that data, then you may have come to a reasonable thing. So if you're doing development and test, if you take one of these pseudonymization problems and apply it to all of the fields, then basically you've pretty much wiped out the possibility. If you want to do marketing analysis or medical analysis or other things, you probably have to do a different kind of anonymization. If you take your security data and you take appropriate measures within this to pseudonymization, for example, replacing the user IDs with a token is probably a good first step. Again, it's to do with the risk. You know, what's the risk of finding one record to do with what someone was doing? So there is a potential for a solution here, but it needs to be carefully thought out. And so, in a sense, what I've been saying to our customers for 2 years is that you need to plan this stuff properly, because if you don't plan it, you're going to end up with penalties and a lot of pain. And so the summary of what I've said today is that there may appear to be conflicts between the different regulations. If you read the regulations carefully, then there is always some kind of get-out which says you have to respect the law across things and to work in a way which is proportional. But what seems to be happening is that time and again we find that organisations, and this isn't limited just to financial services, many organisations still use privacy as an excuse for poor service. That I would like to re-emphasise that there is a data iceberg, and that for that data iceberg, the bit that isn't sort of what you thought was what was going to matter, if you're going to have that data, it's better to pseudonymise it or anonymise it than to just leave it as it is. And that you really need to include this data into your GDPR action plan. So with that, I think I'm perhaps a little bit over time, but I'm still standing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have any questions from us? Okay, is that okay if we take a short break and come back for the last presentation? Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you.